Disabled people love their gadgets. We really do. We're apt to flaunt our latest gizmo, whether it's a running blade or a racing wheelchair. In my rather less athletic case, it's my latest digital braille reader, which is sitting on my lap now as we speak, and has 5,000 books in it. In other words, it tends to be technology that sets us free. Well, the 18th and 19th centuries were no different, except that in those days, the object of desire often turned out to be a wooden leg. And surprisingly sophisticated some of them were too. Well, it's really a rather unusual day here because I'm in the studio with historian Julie Anderson, and between us lies a leg on the table. But this is no ordinary leg. It belonged to the Marquis of Anglesey. His original leg was shot off in the Battle of Waterloo, and he had this made. It's at the moment kept in the Household Cavalry Museum, and they very kindly lent it to us for this programme. And Julie, it's quite a leg. I haven't even touched it yet, but I'm about to.
It is a really rather marvellous leg. So when you touch it, how does it feel to you?
It's huge. It's vast. It's wood, but that's not wood that's covering it, is it?
No, it's got a soft covering across the top of it.
Yes.
This was a high-quality leg. Obviously, the Marquis of Anglesey had a lot of money, and he was able to buy great numbers of these legs. Apparently, he would order them about 4 at a time from his manufacturer, who was James Potts of London. And if we look at the leg here at the top, if you feel up at the top end, you can feel that it's made of wood.
Yeah.
And actually, it's got a little bit of woodworm in it.
Has it?
Yes, you can feel some little holes there.
Oh, yeah.
So it does have some woodworm in it, and that's where the stump would have fit in. And then it's covered with this lovely soft fabric.
Yes, it's got a covering. Would it have had that the whole time? You wouldn't have taken that off, would you?
No, you wouldn't have taken it off. And it made it look more lifelike in a way. It's a skin tone colour. If you feel down towards the knee, there's a bending, articulating knee. If we just bend it slightly.
Oh,
there.
Yeah,
Sorry.
It moves. So
Yes.
It's quite sophisticated, isn't it?
It is indeed.
So this was designed for the Marquis then, but did lots of people have these?
Yes, they did. He popularised this leg enormously throughout Britain. Many people had this leg. Obviously, well-to-do people.
I was going to say, not
had
just
this
any.
leg.
This would have been
No.
pretty expensive, wouldn't
It
it?
certainly would have.
So, OK for the likes of the Marquis of Anglesey. What would you have had if you were poor or perhaps a child?
If you were poor or a child, you would generally have what would be known as a peg leg, which is just a wooden stick. And the stump would sit on top of a wooden stick and be tied on.
Quite a lot of people made their own, didn't they?
Most certainly they did. A lot of people. A peg leg was quite an easy thing for anybody to carve.
And what if you were really poor?
If you were really poor and you weren't able to get around, a lot of people designed their own little trolleys. So what they would have was sort of a skateboard-shaped item which they would sit on top of and wheel themselves around.
And would that have been quite a common sight?
Trolleys would have been very common. They would have been very common amongst beggars and people on the streets, especially in London.
Here you may behold perhaps 500 mutilated creatures of different ages, some clean and decently apparelled, some dirty and almost naked.
Wounded men must have been a common sight on the streets. This was the human cost of war with France, which at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century drained Britain of its healthy young men.
Some have had a hand off and an eye out. Another has had his skull fractured and trepanned and a silver plate substituted. Some with their noses shot off. Some with a wooden leg below the knee. Others with an entirely wooden leg.
During the 22 years of war with the French, tens of thousands of British soldiers and sailors gave their lives for their country. Surviving with a missing limb became tangible evidence of valour and virility. After all, no one was sexier than Lord Nelson.
When a woman has fixed her heart upon a man, it is not a leg, more or less, that will make her change her sentiments. An old tattered military coat and a wooden leg always soften my heart to pity and dispose me to acts of benevolence.
As good a name for it as any. The reality of wearing a wooden leg, though, was anything but romantic.
Come for the pads! Anthony! Halt!
I've got here an extraordinary diary of a soldier, Thomas Jackson, who lost his leg in the Napoleonic Wars. It was brought to me by Caroline Nielsen of Newcastle University.
When I first read this account, I was absolutely amazed by it. I'd not come across anything similar, and I, as yet, haven't.
What intrigues me about Thomas Jackson's is, it's a very vivid and articulate description, isn't it?
Yes, this memoir is quite unique because it does devote a lot of time to the process of what it was like to have the first set of bandages removed after an amputation, when they're trying to help him, when they're trying to redo the bandaging, is terrifying. And it must have been such a painful memory for him. Even 20, 30 years later, he still remembers it in such a vivid way.
I was very anxious for the day to come for my leg to be dressed, hoping to be relieved of some of my pains. But when it did come, never shall I forget the intensity of the suffering I endured in the first dressing. Military surgeons are not very nice about hurting one, what with the tearing off of the bandages, which were by this time soldered together with dried, clotted blood, and after them the cross-strappings of the sticking plaster, which had, as it were, grown into the flesh, the opening of the wound afresh, tying of the ligaments of the arteries, cleansing and new strapping and bandages. I feared in my feeble strength I must have sunk under the excruciating pain.
Thomas Jackson has to have this painful process repeated so often that he and his wife moved to live behind the hospital. For over a year, he has to undergo routine operations to fish out bits of bone and infected flesh. Finally, on the 8th of August 1815, he's examined by Chelsea Hospital and given a pension. And, as a Chelsea pensioner, he's given a free wooden leg.
This new appendage was to be free of cost, a free, gratuitous national gift. Ought I not to have been very grateful? When fitted on, I looked down in sullen silence at the hated appendage, with about the same kind of satisfaction which a dog does when he gets a tin kettle tied to his tail. Ashamed, he runs into the first hiding place he can find to gnaw it off. It is the coarse joke of the vulgar and the sport of impudent children. None have sympathy for the luckless veteran. He sees himself as an isolated being. He is an outcast of society.
Thomas Jackson may have seen himself as an outcast, but in fact he was one of the lucky ones. Or maybe he just never gave up. He's a man of incredible energy. He went on to have a variety of jobs, including being a schoolmaster, and then wrote his very polemical memoirs when he was over 60. Thanks to the wooden leg, he was able to lead an independent life. Others were not so fortunate. Leaving behind the masculine world of war veterans, our next story takes place in the genteel atmosphere of Jane Austen's Bath. But the dancing was off limits for Mary Hartley, a disabled woman whose life has been uncovered by Professor Amanda Vickery of Queen Mary, University of London. Documenting the lives of disabled women in the past is a huge challenge.
I think it's almost impossible to get a picture of what of the experience of disability and what it felt like for most women, because those papers simply do not survive. I mean, for women in general, there's much less of a record than there is for men. For single women, they're like little ghosts in the archive, and disabled women often are single because disability disqualifies you for marriage.
But there are exceptions, and you've found some of them. I mean, tell me about Mary Hartley.
Mary Hartley was a lucky discovery of mine. She appears in a cache of letters I found in the Berkshire Record Office in Reading. And these were these letters from a nurse describing the sufferings and dictating, really, the thoughts and feelings of a woman, Mary Hartley. And Mary Hartley was a spinster. She was the sister of an MP. She had a certain amount of money, and like a lot of sick single women, she gravitated to Bath.
I am very sorry I cannot give you a good count of my dear mistress, who have been in a vast deal of pain ever since I writ last. Her poor leg was so very tender yesterday. She is always a-crying as she dreads the doctor coming.
I thought when I found the letters that she'd gone to Bath so that she could take the treatments and meet the latest doctors. She does have a lot of kind of medical care, but she doesn't go out to the baths, and she isn't wheeled out in that famous invention, the bath chair even, and I thought she would have gone there for the new gadgets, but that does not seem to be the case.
But in some ways, the obvious candidate for a wheelchair, and they were around, so why not? Why did she not have one?
That was the burning question for me when I looked at the letters, because there she is in the 1780s in Bath, surely the fountain of comforts for the sick and disabled. The very years when all these what are called gouty chairs are being advertised in all the new catalogues, and you can see them on exhibition. Also, Mary Hartley does have money, and she buys lots of these new gadgets for entertaining. So she has an account with Matthew Boulton, who's the great Birmingham inventor. But she does not buy anything which improves her mobility. And I think that must be because mobility is just not something prized in genteel women. I think that wheelchairs and the like are targeted at men who've had very active lives and who have been cut down, and for whom it would be thought an extreme injustice for them to be deprived their vigour. But I just don't think that the mobility and independence of women was prized in any way.
Amanda Vickery. Thinking about those soldiers with their wooden legs, and then poor Mary Hartley confining herself to her upstairs room, it reminds me about what disability really is. Perhaps it's always been more about what society expects of you than about what your body can actually physically achieve. It's not just about technology, the invention of wooden legs or wheelchairs. It's about money, class, sex, and ambition, the individual ambition of a soldier like Thomas Jackson.